Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you all with us at this panel session on leadership and ambition for nature and climate in 2021. I'm Beccy Speight. I'm the Chief Executive of the RSPB, and this marks the start of a series of events over 3 days on nature and climate, hosted by ourselves and in close collaboration with our dear colleagues in BirdLife. And I'm delighted today we're going to be joined by a fantastic panel. We're going to be joined by Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we're very honoured that she's made time to be with us this afternoon. We're also going to be joined by Andrea Ledward, who's the Director for International Biodiversity and Climate at Defra, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs for the UK government. We're also joined by Patricia Zurita, who is the Chief Executive of BirdLife International, by James Miller, who is an environmental campaigner and filmmaker and sits on the RSPB Youth Council, and by a very special guest, Aneeshwar Kunchala, and his father, Anil. And Aneeshwar is just 6 years old, but has lots to say. So I'm looking forward to talking to him very shortly. So 2021, it's absolutely clear, and we said this when we set out our RSPB strategy for the next 10 years, and it's true of the decade as well, that it's a time of great crisis, but also a time of great opportunity. So I think the pandemic has absolutely shown us the fragility of our global health and economic systems, the absolute interconnectedness of people and planet, and our dependence on a healthy natural environment in order to thrive ourselves. You know, we've got the heat waves happening at the moment over in North America. It's clear that the natural world has a huge impact on our own well-being and mental health as individual human beings. And people have really, I think, through the lockdowns, taken nature back into their hearts. So that interconnectedness is absolutely there. And we know we have these two really vital COP meetings on climate and biodiversity in the offing. So it feels like a time of huge opportunity, as well as a time when we're absolutely recognising the crisis we're facing into. And the good news is that there has been progress. So more than 80 leaders around the world have now signed that Leaders' Pledge for Nature, committing to halt and to reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030. And that has been a huge step forward, I think. And even the G7 issued its 2030 Nature Compact just in the last few weeks, where nature featured prominently alongside climate change, really for the first time at that level. And there is a growing consensus, I think, on the need to effectively protect at least 30% of our land and our seas for nature by 2030. So there are some good bedrocks on which to build. But the big issue is, are we going to realise that ambition? Are we going to deliver action around the rhetoric? And we know that's going to need a lot of things. So one of them is absolutely the translation of those ambitions into domestic legislation. Here in the UK, at the RSPB, we've been celebrating 100 years since the Plumage Act, which was the first big win for the RSPB in trying to protect birds, and prohibited the importation of feathers and dead birds to be used in high fashion as hat decorations 100 years ago. And we know that right now we've got the Environment Bill for England, for example, making its way through Parliament, and there are some real tensions around just how strong that bill is going to be when it turns into an act. We know we're going to need large-scale financing for the green recovery to kind of get the green economies really up and running, much larger scale than is in the offing at the moment. We know we need particular support for developing countries in terms of the crisis we're facing into and the action we must take. And the issues of social justice have never been writ more large, really, than they are at the moment. And we need to make sure that the enabling conditions are all set up at local level so that we are able to enact the kind of trajectories that have been set out globally by our politicians. Things like the recent publication of the IPBES IPCC joint workshop report, really underlines this growing body of scientific evidence that we can't tackle, the climate crisis in isolation. We can't tackle the nature crisis in isolation. And indeed, a narrow focus only on climate mitigation can pose huge risks to biodiversity and really undermine the ecosystems on which we all depend. And I'm delighted to say that Professor Pete Smith, who's one of the authors of that report, is going to be speaking in a session after this at 3 o'clock. So I think there'll be a link in the chat bar if you want to join that session as well. So as I say, this kicks off a 3-day event series looking at science, policy and practice on nature and climate, and how we need to bring the two together and integrate them in order to find the right way forward. A few quick bits of housekeeping. We are recording this session and I will kick it off very shortly with my conversation with Aneeshwar. And after the panelists have all spoken, there will be a Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function, use the vote function to kind of upvote questions, the usual practice. And I will get through as many of those as I can before we finish at 2:15. So that is how our afternoon is looking. But first of all, I'm going to turn to our special guest, Aneeshwar Kunchala, who is just 6 years old, although he says he's going to be 7 in January. So his next birthday is on the cards. And he lives in Warrington in northwest England. He's incredibly knowledgeable about the natural world. He's already proved himself to be a very good fundraiser, a very good influencer as well. And I've got a few questions that I thought I would put to Aneeshwar as somebody really who represents the generation who's going to be particularly affected by some of the decisions we make both this year and over the coming decades. So hello, Aneeshwar, you're welcome. Nice to see you. Great to see you.
My name is Aneeshwar Kunchala and it's been a pleasure being in this meeting.
Great, good. Well, it's lovely to have you with us. I'm going to ask you my first question, and you won't be surprised by this, Aneeshwar. My first question is, what is your favourite bird and why is it your favourite? So
my favourite bird is a kestrel and hummingbirds. So they have two things in common. They can hover on one spot, but they do it differently. Kestrels like to hover with the heater, pushing it upwards, while the cold air is also kind of helping pushing it upwards. And hummingbirds use their wings to do an 8-like shape, what makes them to go up, down, left, right. And they also can hover while drinking. They even can hover while shaking their heads very quickly.
That's great. And hummingbirds are one of my favourite birds. I remember seeing my first hummingbird when I was in California a number of years ago. And a kestrel, when I was going through lockdown last year, I used to go to my nearest wood for a walk, and every time I went, I would see a kestrel, and every time I would think, yes, the kestrel's still here, still doing its thing, and it would keep me feeling really happy. So I'm glad you've chosen a kestrel and a hummingbird. They're two of my favourites as well.
And also, I even seen a kestrel while I was going to a place. That was one of the other questions I was going to do.
Yeah, so that's my next question here. So tell me about a recent encounter you've had with wildlife, something you've seen just recently.
So recently I actually seen at Sankey Valley. It's a wonderful place to be. It's just like the woods, except it's just like a walkable distance. It's so beautiful. You can see a lot of birds over there, like a lot. I'm not kidding. Really. You can even see something crazy. You can see a grain of dot snail over there. Mm-hmm.
That sounds amazing.
Yes, and also my mum and dad first thought it was a tree creeper. And then when it got a bit lower, I noticed the stripe coming down it. Then I corrected it as a nuthatch. It was so beautiful.
Sounds great. Sounds great. And is that your favourite place to go?
Yes, I even seen a buzzard over there. I know all of you may have seen a buzzard once, but nothing like this, I'm sure. Have you ever seen a buzzard squawking? I have.
It's a great noise. It's a great noise.
Yes, it's just beautiful. And also, I even seen a kestrel above a road, just hovering like nothing, just like a hummingbird. Yes, it's even seen one just flying away. It was on top of a road. It was so beautiful.
Yeah, they are just beautiful, beautiful birds to look at, I think.
Yeah.
So Aneeshwar, today, the meeting we're having today is all about the future and what the future is going to be like. And you're just 6 now, so you're going to be around for many years to come. What's your great hope for the future? Tell us.
My hope. So this is the baddest thing. So this is the biggest problem for the wildlife right now. So it's plastic pollution and animal poaching for their fur, and also loss of habitat. So if we don't act now, these problems would turn really bad. From the bioinspiration and food chain would just collapse. An example, if all the harpy eagles disappeared, all of the spider monkeys and also sloths would go viral. They would eat every plant what they eat. Then none of the animals would survive. That's why herbivores, carnivores, they need to stay in balance.
Absolutely.
So this is my greatest hope for future. Save the animals and make the nature look beautiful.
Keep it beautiful, keep it in balance, keep all those different species going. Yeah, fantastic. Well, Aneeshwar, thank you so much for talking to us. That's been great fun. And I hope you're going to stay on and watch and hear what everyone else has to say as well. Thank you.
Hey. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So it's a hard act to follow, but our first speaker on our panel is Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who is the Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And under her leadership, the new global plan to save nature will be negotiated by countries across the world, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So Elizabeth, I'm going to hand over to you, first of all, just to tell us a little bit about your vision for how nature and climate can come together.
Thank you very much. After the young boy, our child has spoken and probably shown us, but also embarrassed us for not taking appropriate action that he might lose the birds he likes. Now you are putting me to test on the connection between nature and climate agenda and what is needed to bring them together into a greater coherence. I hope that's the question.
It is.
Thank you. So, one, climate and nature emergencies are deeply intertwined with one another. Projections clearly show that biodiversity loss can be twice as high and more under global warming of 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees, and thus altering ecosystem functions, restructuring food webs, accelerating land degradation, and may lead to extinction of species. Biodiverse rich ecosystems such as coral reefs are projected to decline by 70 to 90% at 1.5 degrees of the global warming. So similarly, the response measures to halting biodiversity loss and limiting climate change equally need to be interlinked. You have indicated yourself, as highlighted in the IPBES-IPCC report, reducing deforestation, forest degradation can contribute to lowering annual anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, with emission saving estimates ranging from 0.4 to 5.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. And therefore, integrated actions for climate adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity conservation also provides multiple core benefits for food and water security, livelihood, and job security, including sustainable production and consumption and human health. To bring greater coherence, we really need a balanced approach to limiting climate change and maintaining healthy ecosystems, both of which are essential for a sustainable future. We cannot address one problem at the expense of the other. For example, modification of diverse ecosystems with vast expanses of monoculture or bioenergy plantations could target emission reductions to a certain extent, but may have significant trade-offs with the health of biodiversity and ecosystem functions, and no clear benefits then for climate adaptation. We must therefore ensure that biodiversity safeguards are well integrated into national climate action plans to reach the emission reduction targets, while at the same time realizing the potential of nature-based solutions to simultaneously address nature and climate agenda. Probably I stop there for now. Thank you.
That was great, Elizabeth, thank you. And you kind of set out just some of the evidence that now exists about how that integration could deliver for us, and how indeed if it doesn't, if we can't get that to happen, what some of the consequences might be. That's been really helpful as a kind of framing of the whole panel. And I'm sure we'll get some questions coming through. If I can just remind everyone, do use the Q&A, do upvote your favourite questions, and we will get to them at the end of the panel discussion. Okay, I'm going to turn now to Andrea Ledward, who, as I said, is responsible. She's Director for International Biodiversity and Climate at Defra in the UK government. She's had leadership roles across government over the last 20 years, and she is leading and working very hard on preparation for COP26 coming up in Glasgow at the end of this year. So Andrea, over to you to set out your vision.
Thank you. So I think I'm answering the question about what are the opportunities to bring greater coherence between nature and climate, Becky, is that right?
It is, yep.
Yeah, brilliant. So a few years ago, I'll just start with a story. I went to Cumbria to visit the Cumbria Catchment Pioneer, which was looking at what they were doing to respond to Storm Desmond in 2015. So that was a part of the Lake District up in the northwest of England, where arguably lots of hard infrastructure and potentially not enough preparation for some of the increasing frequency and severity of weather extremes meant that villages were really devastated up there. And what I saw in practice then happening was about spatial mapping of natural capital assets. I saw peat restoration, tree planting, unstraightening of rivers, some natural flood management, involvement of farmers and communities, and very clear success criteria about no human waste floating down the street and roads remaining intact after the next flood. But also it set out to me the potential for then getting more investment into nature and increasing the opportunities for investment in nature, which would have really long-term impacts for those living in that area. And it really brought alive to me, in practice, nature really has to be at the heart of our kind of climate solutions. So I think three main opportunities that I see. One is around shifting the debate, one is around finance, and one is around implementation. So on shifting the debate, I think it's already been mentioned, we've got 3 COPs happening within a very short space of time. We've got COP26 on climate, COP15 on biodiversity, and COP15 on land degradation. Bringing those together, there's a real power because they have to be implemented together for me in terms of solutions on the ground. We've also got science, as you said, Becky. We've had the kind of joint IPBES and IPCC reports, really a game changer, I think, about showing the integration of the evidence. We've also got greater partnerships now. If you look at the Leaders Pledge for Nature, we're also, the UK is chair of the Global Ocean Alliance and co-chair of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. And as you've said, the G7 gives us a very strong platform going into COP26, where the communique in May covered 120 new commitments over 14 areas, which far exceeded both expectations and previous G7 communiques. On finance, we know that only 3% of global climate finance is spent on nature-based solutions. So we want more finance for nature to be mobilised from all sources. And we're confident when you look at the UK's £3 billion pounds that has been announced for nature, that others will also follow and be putting new investments on the table and more finance in advance of COP26. We're also very confident that winds of change are happening on mainstreaming of nature. And then on the third bucket, which is around implementation and planning, the Dasgupta report made very clear that we need to embed biodiversity into core economic and political decision making. And we really see changes there. We see the kind of UK response, particularly thinking about legally binding targets, as you said, Becky, in the Environment Bill coming through alongside our legally binding targets on net zero. We see the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, being critical vehicles to bake in nature-based solutions and commitments. And we see more monitoring and review mechanisms coming alongside the CBD to really make a difference in implementing the new target framework when it is agreed and negotiated. So thank you, Becky.
Thanks, Andrea. That was great. And I think just kind of giving it that context of you going up after Storm Desmond up to the northwest and kind of, you know, seeing the devastation that had been wreaked there and kind of some of the solutions that were possible was really helpful. And then just kind of giving us the context of what the UK is doing right now to kind of try and move us forward on that right trajectory and do some of what I kind of set out in my introduction. It's really helpful. So we've had the global picture very much coming from Elizabeth, and then Andrea giving us that kind of very much a UK perspective. I'm going to go international again now to Patricia Zurita, who is CEO of BirdLife International, the world's largest conservation partnership. She started that role in 2015 and has made enormous progress since then, and it's been a delight for me to come into the RSPB and work alongside her. So Patricia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Becky, and thanks so much to Elizabeth and Andrea. I want to say, Aneeshwar, I am so proud that you like hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are also my favorite bird. I come from that region where hummingbirds are hovering all the time, and I just wanted to give you one quick fact before I start. Hummingbirds are the only bird in the planet that can fly backwards. So now you have it. Becky, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be with you guys and with you all, talking about this very important issue of how do we handle these dual crises that we're living. And Elizabeth and Andrea have put it very clearly. We have to keep understanding the climate and nature crisis as two sides of the same coin. They go hand in hand. The impact of our changing climate is exacerbating the loss of nature, and the loss of nature is actually exacerbating the climate crisis. So they have to be tackled together, or no one wins, and worse, we all lose. Now, the sad part of all of this is that it's not only a dual crisis that is hurting us who love nature and who believe we need to protect the planet for the future. It is a double whammy that is impacting people, our development, our future, and our present. And Andrea just gave a really good example from the UK. I want you all to think about the landslide that just happened in Japan over the weekend. We are encroaching more and more into nature. We are developing more infrastructure and housing in very hilly sides of the Atami region in this particular case. And heavier rains are happening because of climate change. And this combination results in more than 5 people dead and over 1,500 rescue workers working tirelessly to try to find over 100 people that are missing. Unfortunately, this story repeats itself in multiple parts of the world. So let's remember what happened in Freetown in Sierra Leone in 2017. We just need to make sure that we look this as a single coin with 2 sides that feed into each other, but very importantly, and as Andrea was saying, can be turned from a vicious cycle into a virtuous one. For whatever reason, and I have to say possibly because of our fear and clearer connection between the climate crisis and people's safety, there has been a lot more talk and attention to the climate crisis, and not so much to the nature loss and the loss of habitats and biodiversity that Aneeshwar was speaking about. And this has resulted in a lot of funding and public attention to the climate situation, which is fantastic to see. And while many solutions are very good and the commitments to net zero keep increasing, and we're very excited to see that, I continue to fear that we're missing the link to the nature crisis, and especially to the opportunities that nature provides, as Andrea was saying. Also, some because maybe because we're not keeping nature at the heart of the discussion and at the heart of the solution, and we're slowly starting to do so, we're coming up with very clever ideas to resolve the climate crisis that will just continue to destroy our nature. The reliance on forests for biofuels, for example, or the poorly planned renewable energy infrastructure are just exacerbating the loss of nature and creating more and more problems, even if it's helping us get cleaner energy. Now, don't get me wrong, we and I at BirdLife are all in favor of a fast and fair transition to renewable energy. We do have to stop our dependence on fossil fuels, but this cannot be done at the expense of nature. We have to put nature at the heart, as Andrea was saying, and I will keep saying it for the next couple of minutes. Now, to ensure an equitable, carbon neutral, nature positive world, which is what we are hoping that will come up with at the COP in Kunming and in Glasgow, we need to start promoting deliberately a biodiversity inclusive nature-based solutions, and also supporting renewable energy solutions that do not harm nature. We at the BirdLife family, for those of you who don't know us, we are a family of over 113 partners all over the world, in 115 countries, working together using birds as the best ambassador for nature and conserving nature because it is our future. We are working on ensuring that renewable energy is planned properly with our sensitivity analysis tool in the Africa Rift Valley and now in Asia, working very closely with development banks, business and governments to ensure that this transition is done fairly and also taking nature into consideration. And we are very convinced, and we know that, and this came out of the report of the IPBES and the IPCC, that nature-based solutions can provide over 30% of the climate solution, mitigating tons of carbon that shouldn't be emitted. But more importantly, nature-based solutions can help us enhance the protection, the conservation, and the restoration of biodiversity. We heard it from Aneeshwar, we are losing nature. We have to stop, and nature can be an extraordinary solution for our climate crisis. The BirdLife family is working to conserve and manage forests, oceans, peatlands, wetlands, grasslands through the use of nature-based solutions. But we are very, very zeroed on making sure that this happens when nature matters the most. Key biodiversity areas hold significant carbon stocks, and they represent an incredibly important global source that need to be protected on the 30 by 30, as you were saying, Becky, at the beginning, but also making sure that enables us to adapt to the changes that we're already seeing that climate is bringing. So the restoration of nature is going to be incredibly important in the next 10 years, and we are incredibly proud of our involvement and our support to influencing the nature restoration law in Europe. We think it's strong and bold, and it sets up a unique precedent for the rest of the world. We are just advocating for making sure that the budgets are there so we can make it be a reality, and the outcomes and targets of the biodiversity strategy for Europe can be achieved. These next 10 years are crucial. We are at a time out of the pandemic where we're seeing that our encroachment on nature is creating huge devastation and putting the world to a complete stall. But we're also seeing the commitment of the governments of the world to put over $13 trillion to recover us from the pandemic. Now, the key opportunity that we have right now, and is unique, is to make sure that we do that recovery using nature as the key linchpin that holds everything together. We are developing pilots on green recovery in Nigeria, supported by the European Commission and the German government, and looking into Singapore as two different pilots of how we can tell the world that a green recovery is really possible. And I have the pleasure of working with the BirdLife family, and the BirdLife partnership is uniquely positioned to actually push this into a space where we can have much greater financial mobilization, not only for nature, but for nature and climate together, that can deliver sound and sustainable development for us now and in the future, so children like Aneeshwar can have a safer planet. So with that, let me finish just saying that we are incredibly proud of being working very closely with Elizabeth and the team that is supporting the planning of the COP. We are hoping that we will end up with a biodiversity strategy and a global biodiversity framework that are ambitious and bold, because that's what the planet needs right now, and that together with the climate COP in Glasgow helps us really put nature at the heart with nature-based solutions, but really understanding that is not nature wherever and whatever type of nature, is really looking into the most important places that are servicing our planet and that need to be protected and restored. So with that, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Patricia. That was great. And just hearing you talk about kind of adaptation as well as mitigation was really interesting in terms of what nature-based solutions can provide for us, and really emphasising the need to unlock the scale of funding required to make some of this possible. I really took that away from what you said as well. Okay, so we are moving through our panel now. A reminder to keep using that Q&A and upvoting the questions you want asked of the panel later on in the session. I'm going to come now to James Miller, who is an activist and a filmmaker, a youth council member for RSPB. He made his first documentary at the age of 13, which he's probably mortified by now, but anyway, really good to see you, James. And I know that James he told me that he's in isolation at the moment, so we probably are the highlight of his day. So James, you're very welcome. What would you like to tell us about this issue?
100%. No, thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be on this amazing panel. It's really difficult actually deciding what to say to an audience like this, where there are MPs, NGOs, civil servants and scientists all in the audience. So, no matter what I say, more than half the room is always going to know more about what I'm saying than I do. But what I can offer is a different perspective. I'm 19, I'm a full-time student studying natural sciences at university. But also, ever since I was 13 or 14, I've been a part-time environmental activist. And this is something that I got into not because I was concerned about climate change originally, like most of my generation, but actually it was initially from just a love of wildlife and nature. It wasn't long, however, before I came to realize how inextricably interconnected the ecological emergency and the climate crisis were, and how desperate the need was to take action on both in conjunction. So I started campaigning, and I started making films, and I started to give speeches. And every year I find myself getting sucked further and further in, not out of fear. I mean, that's how I started, but in the long term, that's not a sustainable or a healthy driver. What keeps me going day after day is just because it's one of the most rewarding and the most exciting ways that I can spend my spare time. In just the 5 or so years that I've been involved in this space, I've had the privilege of working on some incredible projects with talented, driven and passionate young people from every corner of the globe. There are people in my generation that are doing such amazing things. I mean, you've probably all heard about the climate strikers that have been out every Friday, millions of teenagers out on the streets demanding a better future, and the transformative impact that that's had on public awareness, but also on political discourse. But as well as those, there's so many other groups that you probably don't know about. In Portugal, there's a team of young activists that are taking 33 European countries to court over climate inaction. And if they succeed, those countries will be compelled not only to ramp up their emission cuts, but also to deal with their international contribution to climate change, which would be really exciting. In the US, there's the Sunrise Movement, who to a great extent are actually to credit for climate change being so high up on President Biden's agenda. People just don't know about it because a lot of the campaigning happened behind the scenes. In Ecuador as well, there's a group of activists who are creating the world's first entirely youth-funded nature reserve. They've just raised enough money to purchase 244 acres of the threatened Chocó rainforest, using money entirely raised by young people. In the Netherlands, Boyan Slat, he's an amazing entrepreneur who's created this system to clean the oceans. At the moment, he's tidying up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, but by 2040, he thinks that the same system, which he made when he was 18, that system scaled up may be able to clean 90% of the ocean's floating plastics by 2040. The list goes on, right? There are so many amazing young people who are getting their heads down and doing all they can right now because they know that they can't afford to wait until they're old enough to take seats of power. Imagine if that same determination, that same passion, and that vigor was taken by heads of state. Imagine how different the world would be. Every year, yes, the political narrative is changing, and it's great to see the climate and the biodiversity crises have these place on the international stage like we've never seen it before. But sometimes it feels like that's all there is to it. Words, you know, especially here in the UK, where there's such a gaping void between political rhetoric and what's actually taking place on the ground. And that's dangerous because it's not just me that's getting disillusioned. What's really concerning is the impact that that's going to have on global efforts, because this year we're meant to be leaders. We're hosting COP26 in November, and how far we go and how credible we are in the pledges that we bring forward is going to be a major influencing factor on international ambition. And at the moment, I think we're running a very serious risk of endangering the success of that summit, and we have very little time to turn that around. And it's the same, by the way, with biodiversity. We claim to be a leader in nature protection, and yet last year we may have failed as many as 17 of our 20 Aichi targets under the CBD, and our species are in freefall decline. I know on this call I'm probably preaching to the converted, but you know, I think there are ways that we can all improve. Whether we make compromises all the time, whether that's MPs having to fall in line with the party whip, or scientists feeling pressure not to be too alarmist or emotional when communicating their findings, or NGOs worrying about losing their membership if they're perceived as too extreme. These are all totally understandable, and actually I think I've noticed some really refreshing boldness from all quarters in the last year or so, but nevertheless we've got to understand now that the situation is so urgent that we cannot hold ourselves back in any way. Scientists think that we're on the verge of tipping 9 of 15 identified tipping elements in Earth's biophysical systems, and that we may have crossed 3 already. The first of those, the Arctic summer sea ice, which will affect everything from Northern Hemisphere weather to the monsoon systems that feed the Amazon. The second, the West Antarctic glaciers, which are starting to slide irreversibly into the ocean, and that may commit us to another 1 to 2 meters of unstoppable sea level rise. And thirdly, the tropical coral reefs, of which we've already lost so many, and scientists think that even if we keep below 1.5 degrees, we may lose up to 90% of. So I know that the world that my generation is going to inherit will be very different from the one that most of you did. I know that we're going to lose so much, and that will be heartbreaking. But what I do know, or what I believe anyway, is that there will come a point where everything starts to get better, where we start to see each year bring more rainforest replanted rather than destroyed, where the seas are being emptied of plastics and not filled, you know, where species aren't going extinct, but their populations are rebounding. That we'll reach this point where we end this cycle of destruction that we've inflicted on our planet for so many centuries, and we start to actively restore it and enjoy all of the co-benefits that that brings to society. I truly believe that as a global community, this is possible. And actually, I think we're going to be very privileged to see that day, because this is something that previous generations never even saw on the horizon. But for us, this change is a matter of necessity, and it's utterly dependent on what happens in this critical decade, and indeed, actually this critical year for our planet. And that's why we're here today. Thank you.
Thanks, James. It was fantastic to have our panel framed, I think, by Aneeshwar's remarks at the beginning as somebody who's 6, and then James as somebody who's 19, both of whom are members of these generations that are going to inherit whatever situation we create for them over this year and the coming decade. And James, thank you so much for reminding us so well of the kind of the urgency of the situation, the drivers behind particularly kind of youth activism on the issues, and ending with that kind of that positive future that we could choose to take in terms of integrating climate and nature and finding the solutions we need. So thank you for that. Okay, so before we turn to the Q&A, we know that this panel in particular frames the next 3 days of discussions that we're going to be having. And so I wanted to turn to each of our panel members and just ask them to give one challenge for the participants in those future discussions over the coming week. So we'll be discussing science, we'll be discussing policy, we'll be discussing the practice of tackling the nature and climate crisis over the next 3 days in an integrated way. And I just wanted each member of the panel to kind of frame a challenge really for the participants in that discussion. What would you really like those participants to be holding in their minds? What's the challenge as they go forward? So I'm going to come to each panel member in turn before we move into the Q&A. So I'm going to come back first of all to Elizabeth, who just framed that kind of global context for us so well. So Elizabeth, what would be your challenge for the participants over the coming 3 days?
The main challenge I can think of is basically, I will use the word action, because we know the problems. We also know the solutions to the problems. What we are missing is we also know how to solve those problems. What is still missing, and which we all talk about day and night, is actually the action on the ground to make the changes needed. And those actions, be it innovative, transformative, but some action on the ground to move us from where we are to the better world we all want to see, or the better future. So action, action is the buzzword. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So that's Elizabeth's challenge for all of us over the next 3 days. It's how do we get the translation into action on the ground, which is what we need now in order to deliver some of what's being talked about. I'm going to turn now to Andrea. Andrea, what is your challenge for participants in the coming 3 days discussions? Oh, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Good. That was just, otherwise you'd have had my small child who's currently homeschooling and self-isolating. So I think, Becky, I would suggest, first thing is don't speak in echo chambers. I think it's really important that we need to bring together the debates about nature, climate and people, which means that economic development and economic growth. We need to show that actually investing in nature-based solutions, investing in nature and the climate is part of a green growth strategy. It's part of building back better. We need to also make sure that then in the conversations that we're having and the action that happens, that women, young people, Indigenous groups need to be really heard and to be part of defining the solutions, so it's not an exclusive agenda. And then finally, I would just say keep it simple and collaborate. I think collaboration rather than competition is the real key in this space. Thank you.
That was great. That was at least 4 challenges. That was brilliant. So so there we've got kind of, you know, I suppose the overwhelming challenge from Andrea was don't speak in echo chambers. So make sure that we are building kind of the investment we need as part of the green growth strategy, that we're kind of hearing the voices of what can be excluded groups, kind of women, young people, and making sure that we kind of really kind of collaborate in finding these solutions. So that was Andrea's challenge for participants. I'm going to turn now to Patricia. Patricia, what's your challenge?
I'm going to say 2. Number 1, I think we still have to bring the climate and nature discussions closer together. And as Andrea said, use nature as a key solution to it, not only for the biodiversity and climate crisis, but for now our recovery. Think about how can we really put nature at the heart of it. And the second one, and I am not necessarily disagreeing with Elizabeth, but I think in terms for us to be able to have more action on the ground, we have to think about how do we make the financing of nature-based solutions and the nature crisis a lot more viable. Nature receives so little funding right now that we need to look into how do we make it more viable financially? How do we change those financial flows that are right now jeopardizing and harming nature into making it more viable for our future and for climate? So those 2.
Great, thank you. Okay, so basically saying, you know, how do we kind of really get climate and nature close together and get nature at the heart of what we need to do? That was kind of the first of Patricia's challenges, I think. And the second was very much how do we get the viability of financing to work? So building a bit around what Andrea said about kind of building into that green economic recovery. How do we really make that viable in terms of the financing that we need? Okay, great. And so I'm going to turn last of all to James for his challenge to participants in the discussions. James.
Yeah, I really agree with what Andrea said. I think what's really important is building collaborations and, you know, making links and partnerships that will allow us to make changes on the scale that we need. But also, I think equally important is that that everyone is inspired, because I know I've only been in the space for 5 years and I find it very difficult to keep going year after year. And I can't imagine for people who've maybe been in this longer than I've been alive, how difficult that must be. And I always find that coming to conferences and things like these, where you're speaking with like-minded people and taking a very solution-orientated approach, can be really reinvigorating. So I just want to, encourage everyone to get fully immersed and reinvigorated, and get sucked really ever deeper into what are some of the most beautiful solutions to environmental problems that there are.
Great. Thank you, James. So that was all about kind of collaboration, echoing that thing that Andrea said about needing to collaborate to find the solutions, but also using that as a source of inspiration and building our own resilience as we continue to kind of push for the change that we want to see. And James kind of, you know, empathizing, I think, with people who have been doing that for longer than he's been alive, as he said. Okay, right. So those are the challenges that we really want participants to kind of hold in their heads as they go into subsequent sessions and discussions over the next 3 days. But for now, we've got some questions that have come in as the panelists have been talking. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A now and just see if we can move through some of these questions that you've all upvoted. So the most popular question that we've had it's quite a long question, but I'll try and do it justice. So given industrial agriculture is the biggest cause of terrestrial biodiversity loss and the second largest global source of greenhouse gases after burning fossil fuels, and it's the main driver of global deforestation, isn't it time we address the massive overconsumption of cheap agri-commodities, so meat, soya, palm oil, cocoa, etc., in the global north? What actions can the UK take to ensure that the UK's consumption of agri-commodities is in line with what nature can provide on a sustainable basis and not just legal? So Andrea, I think I'm going to come to you first on that one.
Thanks, Becky. So yeah, in 2018, we commissioned a global resource initiative, an independent group chaired by City in Cheshire, to advise us really on exactly this question and how we could reduce our impact across the globe, because 80% deforestation is driven by agriculture, much of which is then about producing commodities that we use on a daily basis: palm oil, soy, timber. And so I think there's a few things that are kind of underway which give me kind of hope. I mean, deforestation, so a few things that we're doing. One is that as part of COP26 preparations, we're convening something called a FACT dialogue, which is food, agriculture, commodity and trade, which is where we have brought together producer and consumer countries from across the globe to think about their supply chains and thinking about how to make those supply chains more sustainable. So that is a critical track of work underway with 26 countries that will kind of feed directly into, we hope, a very ambitious outcome at COP26 itself. That's music practice, apologies. The second thing is that we are legislating in the Environment Bill. So we are legislating due diligence, which means that all the timber we import in the future is going to be from kind of legally verified sources and not be driving deforestation. And we also have clauses in the Environment Bill which will help us to look at other commodities like soy and palm oil and other commodities. And then obviously we're also looking at kind of the UK's global footprint, and one of the recommendations in the Global Resource Initiative paper was around us looking at developing a global footprint indicator. And there's some really great work going on with organisations like Tesco, WWF, looking at basically how can we measure the impacts of what we buy? How do you make our shopping baskets more sustainable? So how do you get more transparency through our supply chains, but also how do we understand and quantify what the impacts are down those kind of supply chains? And so I think that metrics work being led really by, I think, WWF and others is absolutely critical. So you have to come at it from a number of different ways. There's no silver bullet, I think, is the answer. You know, consumers want certain products at certain prices, and so we've got to get the incentives right all the way through the kind of systems to make the difference that we need to.
Great, thank you. And it was great to hear that bit of practice going on in the background as well. Okay, I'm going to ask can I ask all the panelists just to kind of come back on camera so I can see you all and kind of aim my questions at you with dexterity. Okay, next question we've got in terms of popularity is a question really, it's a statement and then a question. So it says there's welcome progress, but is there still not a real gulf between the sum of rhetoric and committed action and what is needed to make the necessary difference with climate and nature? So this kind of rhetoric action issue, and it's been asked for Andrea, but I'm going to just kind of give her a moment's break. And actually, Elizabeth, you raised this particularly in your kind of challenge to participants. So I wondered if you just wanted to come on this. So the gulf between the kind of rhetoric and committed action and what's really needed to make the difference.
Indeed, it's a good question, and probably that's why I underlined as the major challenge the issue of action, so that we move away from theory, we move away from talking, and many times we talk to the converted, delighted that this event has brought in our child and the youth. Many times it's not the case. And this is the generation of tomorrow we leave behind. So it's important to hear their views, and James has given us the examples of a group going to court, and if they win, what will happen. So still action is important, but of course that action needs that cooperation partnership. We all need to be on the same train or on the same wagon moving forward, and to also making the connection. You cannot deal with biodiversity loss now is very clearly without looking at climate change, or looking at climate change in isolation from biodiversity loss, because we see and we know now that each has co-benefit to the other and vice versa. So one, we need to make this connection, and therefore what actions need to take place on the ground, which responds both to biodiversity loss at the same time to climate change, or climate change contributing to reversing and halting biodiversity loss. So again, let's move away from theory. Business as usual is no longer an option. And if it's no longer an option, what are these transformative actions to move us forward? We have said Aichi targets over a decade. We have only made limited progress, but not reached any of the Aichi targets. Do we go back to the same business as usual, or major transformative changes need to happen to make a difference in this decade we are already in, where we are told it's the last chance we have? We either make it or perish with it. Me and you, Beccy, we can perish, but not James and the child who has spoken to us, whom we want to take them to inherit a sustainable, clean planet. Thank you.
Andrea, did you want to comment on that? If practice is kind of allowing you to do so, did you want to comment on that from a UK perspective? Because I know it's something that kind of gets bandied around in terms of the UK government. It's kind of the gulf between kind of rhetoric and action. I just wondered if you wanted to give a view from the kind of UK perspective.
Yeah, very happy to. I think, I mean, for us, I mean, the Environment Bill has obviously been postponed a few times. It's obviously now back. I mean, for us, the Environment Bill, I think, is really the new governance framework that is going to really set the framework in stone that will shift the incentives for us. I mean, I think we see the legally binding targets, the new interventions around things like biodiversity net gain, which now applies to major nationally significant infrastructure as well as housing. When you put that alongside the changes that we're making on things like the agricultural transition and the way we're actually going to pay farmers to manage the land, you put those together and actually you see very big kind of shifts in those entire systems domestically. And I think what I was going to say then internationally is that we're looking through the lens really of trying to do three things. One, which is about how do we better protect and restore nature? And this is the kind of criticality of having targets, for example, around the kind of 30 by 30 to bend the curve on biodiversity decline. But it's not enough just to have those targets there. It's the quality of that protection, the quality of the restoration and the engagement of communities and the incentives that are there to make sure that we're not at the same time sending in very counterintuitive different messages about why that nature needs to be destroyed or degraded. So investment is really critical. And on the nature side, I don't think it is just about more kind of international aid money and more international. I think it is also about eliminating harmful money in the system. And this is where the kind of subsidies that are in the system really need to be shifted, and where we have a good story domestically actually about what we're doing in shifting out of the common agricultural policy. But it is hard to do that. You look at countries across the world, India and others, where they have tried to do very political changes in subsidies and agricultural reform. It is very, very political, and it is not a quick fix. So I can see how it is frustrating that things take time. And we're working on a sustainable agriculture dialogue for COP26, where again, we've been working on this just rural transition since it was announced in 2019. And there is frustration inside as well as outside government about, oh, not another dialogue, not another kind of policy report, you know, when's it going to change? And ultimately, these are kind of, you know, it's sovereign nations, countries who are making decisions about management of their land to protect jobs, protect livelihoods, and support their economic growth, which is why it has to come back to being an embedded part of kind of countries' fundamental kind of growth paths for me. And then the final part for us is all about transition for us. It's about, again, using things like the fact dialogue to really shift the incentives, the transparency, and to shift the kind of rules of the game essentially globally, which is, and it's got to be done across the world, and it's got to be done in a more coherent way. It's no point doing it in one jurisdiction if you're not then doing it in other places, which are the kind of main consumers. So you need to look at the kind of Indian market, Chinese market and others, and look at how we can potentially influence and also play into those and some of the incentives set with the very big traders in those markets as well.
Yeah, I think that your point about coherence is well made, actually, Andrea. So thank you for that UK perspective. I'm just going to keep moving through these questions because we've got lots coming in now. I'm going to come to James and Patricia from their kind of perspectives as kind of activists and then as kind of, you know, a big kind of NGO kind of CEO. It says more and more people are becoming motivated to act for nature and biodiversity as we prepare for the 2 COPs this year. What are the top 3 things that you would encourage individuals to do to support nature and biodiversity conservation? So kind of coming from the kind of systemic changes that kind of Andrea and Elizabeth were talking about, down to kind of what are the top 3 things you'd encourage individuals to do? So I'll come to Patricia first on that, please, and then James.
So to me, the big 3 things that people need to do as individuals is think about what you're consuming. Where is it coming from, and is it actually damaging nature in the process? Number 2, as James was saying, participate in voicing your message to the leaders. You know, I mean, Andrea was talking about, we are at a point where we are designing a new bill for nature. We were in the process in Europe. We have been looking into a lot of other countries that are going to be using the global biodiversity framework to adopt it. Having you as citizens voicing your message that nature needs to be at the heart of the solution is incredibly important, and be part of the message. But I think the other thing, the last thing that I would say is, people don't realize that we're losing nature. And yes, more people are starting to become aware of it, but I think we need to make sure, and I am convinced that we need to make sure that we need a global mobilization to realize that we're losing our planet. and talking to your friends, talking to your family, talking to your neighbors, to your community about this situation, and go beyond the like-minded, like we're doing right now, but going beyond those people that are not necessarily talking about this and don't know that we are living this incredibly important crisis, and that it needs to be taken care of, and that they need to also voice their positions and be able to help us mobilize the world towards ensuring that we stop the crises.
Okay, right. So think about yourself as a consumer, participate, and then kind of go beyond your immediate circle in terms of kind of laying out that kind of that crisis in nature. James, what would you say?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? There's so many different things. I think I would mirror what Patricia said in a way. I think start off by thinking of yourself as a consumer. For me, one of the big changes that I've made a couple of years ago was to become vegetarian, and now very slowly starting to try to become vegan as well. I think that diet can have a huge impact. Another thing is actually not many people realize is where their money's held, what bank they use, where their pension sits, can actually have an impact on the same scale or larger than other elements of your footprint, like transport and diet. So that's another big thing. And again, I think being aware of the impact that you have outside of your own footprint as well, whether that's how you vote, whether that's joining organizations and becoming a bit of an activist yourself, or simply just the ripple effects, and thinking about your actions and how they rub off on people around you, because we're all part of different communities. I'm part of a university, and for example, in what I do impacts how people around me behave. I think there was a study that was done either in the US or the UK recently, which was talking to people who'd started to fly less, and they found that one of the major reasons that people had started to fly less was because their friends had started to fly less. And so this ripple effect is a phenomenon, and it's actually having already a significant impact on the world. So yeah, think about your own personal consumer decisions, think about where your money is, and think about the impact that you can have outside of your own footprint.
Great, good challenges to set out for people. Thank you. Okay, we're back up to the kind of the global level now. The next question. So moving back from the individual to kind of what's happening across the world. And this is a question really around kind of climate and what we've learned from how we've approached the climate crisis so far. So the question says, UNFCCC has proven much better at driving and monitoring national implementing action than CBD. So what are the features of the climate treaty that the nature treaty could emulate? And what should a leading national government, hopefully the UK, do before the COPs to help ensure the post-HE framework can actually succeed? So it's a question really about what do we learn from the climate treaty to apply to the nature treaty, and what should a leading national government be doing to help ensure that the framework that's going to come out of CBD 15 can actually succeed. So I am going to go first of all to Patricia on this one, actually. Patricia.
Thank you. I think the key lesson that we need to learn from the UNFCCC for the CBD COP is that we have to have very clear measurable targets. And the HE target that was moved along and that moved the needle most was the one on protected areas. Knowing how much area we needed to protect was possibly the most important one in terms of the HE targets. Making them really measurable and tangible, I think it's incredibly important. But I think it's also making sure that we have the right commitment. Because when you think about who was behind the Paris Agreement and who was from the governments really being represented, it was not only the ministers of environment that were there. It was the ministers of finance, it was the ministers of development that were actually part of the discussion, and ensuring that we have that same level of high-level commitment of the governments when we are designing the global biodiversity framework, and realizing that nature matters not only because of us nature lovers, but because of our development and our future. And it is critical for the economy, it's critical for development, it's critical for health, as we are seeing with the pandemic. the more traction we are going to get and the better implementation is going to happen. And in terms of how the UK could actually catch up on the Aichi targets, not easy. We are far behind, and we, there's not enough time. But I think what we can do is use the political savviness and the strength of the UK as part of the negotiation team going into the COP and as one of the parties, and a very important one, to make sure that we can end up with a global biodiversity framework that is, one, very ambitious because we don't have time, but two, very measurable and that holds countries and parties accountable.
Thank you. So kind of measurability and kind of being able to hold kind of progress to account, really, and kind of then translating that into that sort of national government framework. Elizabeth, I just wanted to come to you quickly on this question as well, because obviously it's kind of saying, what can we learn from the climate treaty to apply to the nature treaty? And you must be wrestling with this day in, day out. So, what would your view be on that?
I will have 4 points on the question. One, going back to a bit of history, which I tend to agree with Patricia. And that's what we have learned from the climate change in terms of action at national level. The focal points at national level for climate change in a number of countries are, as Patricia said, ministries of finance, development, and the like. And that's where the pocket is. While biodiversity's focal points have mostly been the ministries of environment. And we know at national level, ministries of environment are the weakest of the ministries, both in terms of all sorts of resources you can talk about. So that has been one major setback, and delighted the fact that now we are learning of the connection between climate change and biodiversity. The issue of mainstreaming of national economic sectors has taken a really upper level discussion, both internationally and national level. That where we say solution, you cannot deal with climate change without biodiversity, and at national level, then the integrated holistic approach, whole of government, whole of society approach, mainstreaming all sectors of the economy, be finance, environment, fisheries, agriculture, and the like, becomes part of that solution. 3, for climate change, which Patricia has touched upon, is the ability to identify this one single measurable goal, 1.5 degrees centigrade. Very difficult for biodiversity, where you are talking of ecosystems, species, agriculture, forests, marine. I mean, it's the entire spectrum of issues. And therefore, to identify that one measurable goal is an issue which negotiators are still struggling with. What is being mostly referred to is nature positive, net nature positive, but not similar to the 1.5 degrees. And that's what we are learning with difficulty from the climate community. Lastly, the lessons we have learned from the current situation of the COVID-19. Probably, if not for the COVID-19 pandemic, both the impacts and lessons learned, maybe the awareness that we have today on nature, on biodiversity, will not have been at the level it is today since the last probably 1 year plus than before. Because again, we all now seems to understand or associate this COVID is the result of our actions on nature, interference to human actions on nature. So that has brought that major awareness, understanding on the importance of nature than ever before, I think, in the history of humankind. And that has enabled to lift the level of not just understanding of nature, biodiversity, and climate change, but also now understanding the connection between the two, and that solutions are on nature. Even when you talk of climate change, you are still looking at nature. And unless we deal with nature, unless our actions on nature change, then it means we need to be ready for future COVID-related pandemics if nothing happens today. So that's how I will look at the connection between the two and what then we learn from climate change. But I think what we also learn from biodiversity for climate change, especially now that climate change is looking at nature as solutions for climate change, adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm really sorry, but we are almost out of time. So I'm going to have, there are lots more questions and some really good questions, but we're going to have to kind of wrap it up. And lots of, James, lots of lovely remarks about your impassioned case for urgency as well. So it was really good to hear that. So I'm just going to kind of remind you all of the challenges that the panel set for the next 3 days. So, you know, from Elizabeth, we had kind of how do we get action on the ground? From Andrea, we had kind of don't speak in an echo chamber, you know, build it into the green growth strategy, you know, make sure that those excluded voices, the voices that are often excluded, are really heard, and collaborate towards the solutions. From Patricia, we had kind of, you know, really engaging that kind of climate and nature integration and really putting nature at the heart of the answers and making sure that the finance that we need is in place. And from James, you had that kind of, you know, we have to collaborate to find the answers, and that we have to continue to kind of take inspiration from this kind of conversation in order to give us the resilience to keep driving for the change that we see. So some really good challenges those there for the coming conversations. The links to the other events I think are going to be in the chat, so if you want to join some of the other events that are open to the public and you're not signed up yet, then I would really encourage you to do so. It just remains for me to say a huge thank you to our great panel. Fantastic panel, really, really good. Some really good perspectives there to kind of get all of our juices going as we kind of go into this 3 days of discussions. Huge thanks to them, and huge thanks in particular to Aneeshwar, our special guest, who just set the whole thing off with such a lovely tone at the beginning. Yay for kestrels and hummingbirds. I completely kind of agree with that. So thank you so much. Thank you to all the guys doing technical stuff behind the scenes and the people who've organised this coming few days events. I think it's going to be a really interesting set of discussions. So thank you to all of you for attending, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.